Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to ODI Global. I'm Suma Chakrabarti, the chair of the ODI Global Board of Trustees, and thank you all for being with us today here in person. I think quite a few people online as well. It's really wonderful to actually welcome you all to ODI Global because this is one of our final events in this building, actually, before we make our move in a few weeks' time to our new office in Westminster. And I think it's fitting that we mark this moment with such a timely and important conversation. I'm delighted that Montek Singh Ahluwalia has agreed to speak at ODI. I've known Montek for nearly 30 years, I counted, from my time at DFID and earlier, when Montek was the first head of the IMF's evaluation department, and then as deputy chairman of the Indian Planning Commission in the Indian government from 2004 to 2014. But actually, Montek, I feel I've actually known you a lot longer than that, because our association, though you won't be aware of it, began when I was writing my undergraduate thesis in 1981 on the impact on growth and distribution of the Green Revolution in India, comparing your home state, Punjab, with mine, West Bengal. And the seminal reference text for my work was co-authored by a very young World Bank economist, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It was called Redistribution with Growth, and showed how both goals could be reached in tandem. So I'm indebted to Montek, in fact, and his co-authors for providing the intellectual framework for my own thesis. And Montek was born in what is now Pakistan. He studied in Delhi and Oxford. In fact, as it turns out, overlapping with my father at St. Antony's College as well. Montek went on to a very successful career at the World Bank, where he ran the income distribution division at the Development Research Centre. He returned to India at the end of the 1970s to work in the finance, commerce ministries and in the Prime Minister's office. And it's in the early 1990s when I heard Montek's name again, by that time as finance secretary and working hand in hand with Finance Minister Montek Singh on rescuing India from the debt crisis and introducing the economic reform agenda that began dismantling what we used to call the license Raj and trade restrictions and moving the country towards a more open market economy. I think it's quite difficult for many today who are starting out on their careers to realize how big a break that was from established economic policy in India. But for my generation of Indians, I think we recognize what a seminal period that was in Indian politics and economics, representing really what I would call a very radical mindset change. After that period, Montek became the first head of the Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF. This was a bold attempt, I think, to review the lessons from the fund's many adjustment programs. The IMF, in my view, being a rather closed and hierarchical organization, I think may not have found the experience of having its homework marked by an independent mind from an emerging market. I don't think they find it all that enjoyable. But for those of us, such as those of us here in ODI, who like evidence-based policymaking, this was actually a very refreshing change that Montek led. And then it was back to political and policymaking life in India, as Montek joined Prime Minister Montek Singh's government in 2004 for a 10-year stint as deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. It's a cabinet-level post. I was by then permanent secretary at DFID and enjoyed many discussions with Montek, and it was with his support that I sought to convince my ministers back here in London that the UK should move from a focus on aid volume in India towards filling advisory gaps in support of economic reforms in the country, for example, around establishing PPPs. Now, Montek has always been a very prolific author over the years, since that 1974 study on redistribution and growth. He's written on a wide range of subjects: education, rural development, energy, and the pandemic. I strongly recommend his book, I think in my view wrongly entitled Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years. It should have been Front Stage, my role in the downfall of the planned economy, but you're far too modest. More recently, I think Montek has turned his attention to climate change, and I'm looking forward to hearing him today on this subject, especially a question that he and I have debated for a long time, on whether India should move from being a bit of a follower on the international stage, waiting for the advanced economies to come good on their pledges around finance and technology transfer, or forge ahead, show leadership, and take action on its own account. Three characteristics that I think I would say describe Montek very well himself as well. Montek, you're very welcome here at ODI. Over to you, Hans-Peter.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure having you, Montek. It's wonderful that you chose to come to us to sort of launch and discuss your paper. Suma has provided all the necessary background on your impact on Indian economic policymaking, and now that you're applying these thoughts to the climate agenda, it's going to have an impact as well. And we would sort of like to understand it in this discussion, hear from you, and then perhaps be able to ask some questions. So the way we wanted to set this up is that give an opportunity to introduce your papers on key messages. Do we have the slides? They will be on the screen. Yeah. And then I'll have a few leading questions. We have a bit of a discussion about that. And then a couple of colleagues, Jody Keane, Sarah Collenbrander, are going to have some comments, and we'll open it up. So that's the basic idea. And with that, Montek, over to you. Ready for your...
Thank you. Many thanks, Suma and Hans, for those very kind words. And thank you all for coming, including those who may be online. I mean, I realize that this is a beginning of summer, so to have that many people with high quality to chat with is actually quite a privilege. You know, I've been given very strict ration, 5 up to 6 minutes to simply scope the paper, as it were. So let me just spend whatever time I have. It contains 4 sections broadly. The first section talks about how efforts to develop a global consensus around climate change evolved. And I mean, these things, you know, if you have meetings every year with 10,000 people attending, whether you like it or not, they affect people's perceptions of priorities. And my assessment has been that, you know, while they contributed to broadening the consensus, the truth is that in the last couple of years, that has become completely frayed. So whatever consensus existed is now in suspended animation. And the reason I raise this is that it's a relevant question for India, because whatever policies India is going to follow cannot be independent of what's happening around the world, at least in the area of mitigation. I mean, as far as adaptation is concerned, you get whatever benefits you're going to get from adaptation. And while you can blame the world for making it necessary for you to adapt, there's no logical reason for them to subsidize you. On mitigation, there was a logical reason to cooperate, and also a logical reason to assist weaker countries in the hope of persuading them to do more. And that has really come completely undone. I want to emphasize, by the way, it's not just the result of the Trump administration's change of policies, because these problems began to surface even earlier. Because at COP28, when they reviewed what was done in Glasgow, and Glasgow was a major change, that's when India said we're going to do net zero by 2070, a very major commitment made by our Prime Minister. When they reviewed the commitments, the assessment was that most countries aren't doing what they said they were going to do. And if they did, it wouldn't get you to the target. So even the degree of commitment was not enough. But you could hope that, you know, over time, this would improve. The big disappointment for developing countries, of course, was Baku, because after much talk of huge sums of money, now, admittedly, the protagonists of more aid always overstate what they can get. But this was an environment in which even Janet Yellen said, we need trillions and we're talking about billions. So there was a sense that maybe there is a broader consensus. Well before the Trump administration took over, Baku made it quite clear that the developing countries sort of were being led up the garden path, and that nothing like the scale of resources that they were being encouraged to believe were going to come. I mean, if I remember the numbers correctly, the estimates of requirements for 2035, which nobody disputed, plus the assumption that 60% of that would be met domestically, led to a gap of $1.3 trillion by 2035, which had to be met by some combination of private and public finance. And of course, everybody sort of tried to reduce the public as much as possible. But what actually came out, instead of say 650, actually came out was 300. And the post-Trump phenomenon modifies that further, because the present position, I don't really know this, but everybody says that the World Bank has been told not to mention climate change anywhere. And they are quite dutifully achieving this direction. So, you wonder, does it really mean, would it be more reasonable to assume that nothing more than a continuation of the present level is the best you can hope for, with some renaming of what used to be called climate change into energy sustainability, something of that kind? So in this background, we've been in India working, some of us and many of us actually, building on Mr. Modi's commitment that we must go to net zero by whatever, 2070. That gave a kind of governmental seal of approval. And even many of the people, let's say within the government, different ministries, weren't quite happy with it, but they didn't want to question that. So you could make a speech on climate change saying, since the prime minister has committed, this is what we must do. And this is what I've been trying to do. Basically driving home the fact that it's a good commitment and it requires us to do something very specific. And what we've not done is that specific stuff. Now, obviously, the question comes up in India, as Suma said, that, the redistribution with growth sort of problem was solved by saying you would do both. So the question now is, can you get growth and decarbonization? And of course, that's what everybody's trying to do. And the broad picture is that it can be achieved through a combination of electrification and a shift in the nature of supply of electricity towards renewables. And the two are quite different things, in the sense you can electrify your entire transport and still fuel it by coal-based electricity. So I want to just show one slide, which at this point, this is the time when you unveil the single slide. We've been working with models, everybody else has been doing. This is the work of my colleague, Utkarsh Patel. Not joint work, but still I'm associated with it. And he's working with a model similar to the ones that PIC, the Potsdam Institute, does for their subcategories. And what this model shows is that the red line is what would happen if we carry on doing what we are doing. Carry on doing what we are doing doesn't mean we do nothing. It just means that the pace of transformation is what is currently underway, and we maintain that. And that you can see that there's nowhere near net zero in 2070. On the other hand, the good news is that according to the model, there are a number of policy instruments that can be moved around with some economic justification, which would bring it down very, very sharply. But even in the modified curve, India's emissions will rise up to 2030 and more or less flatten out by 2035 and then start falling. So there's a lot of criticism, particularly amongst NGOs, that the rest of the world emissions are falling and India's emissions are rising. This, in my view, is a misrepresentation of the reality. I mean, the rest of the world's emissions are falling from per capita emissions, which are huge, and they should fall, and they should fall faster than they're doing. I think it's reasonable for India to expect that we will have an increase in emissions, but then they will go down. But to be credible, we ought to be able to lay out what are we going to do in the next 10 years, that's between 2025 to 2035, which will give a reasonable assumption, expectation that we can bend the curve. Now, one thing is very clear, that if by 2035 we bend the curve as much as is shown, that's not the end of it. We have to keep doing more. But I think we will have established credibility that it can be done. So this paper tries to say what should we do in the next 10 years? And I mean, obviously, the biggest thing is what you do in power. And the second biggest thing is what you do in transport, and some stuff on industry, basically electrifying whatever of industry is possible. Now, these things have to be done in parallel and in a way, in a disconnected manner. I mean, the electrification of vehicles shouldn't be jeopardized or halted because not enough is being done to decarbonize electricity. we will have achieved a big strategic transformation by electrifying transport. And then we have to do the separate battle of, decarbonizing electricity. I've got only 2 minutes left. So let me just say that having said this, for India, the big problem is you make a list of all the policies that are needed, and the paper that's been distributed has a lot of them. You'll find that, there's a national level set of policies and a state level set of policies, particularly in electricity, how the regulatory system works, how price variation is allowed for, how decentralized it is, or in transport. I mean, most of the action is at the state level. So really when we say we need a national plan, which is what we do say, I mean, we need kind of a national plan framework, which has to be then decomposed into specific quantitative targets for individual states. Now, the good news is, and this is what maybe the consciousness raising activity of the COPs has achieved, is that every state chief minister thinks wrongly. Indians always think that the rest of the world is always looking at India, which is not actually true. But if it does lead to some good things, nothing wrong with it. But you do find people saying, which is nice. I mean, Tamil Nadu, for example, explicitly says, look, we are a more developed part of India than the rest of India. And so if the prime minister has said India will go net zero by 2070, Tamil Nadu should go net zero by 2060. Now it's all in the realm of slogans, but slogans affect perceptions, priorities. Several states are now in the process of working out their own transition plans. But I think what is happening is that we're not necessarily taking the hard decisions. And quite frankly, this transition won't happen unless there's a willingness to take hard decisions. Now, one of the hard decisions, for example, would be a carbon tax. There's no chance of nobody else in the world is doing it, so we won't be doing it either. But we are bringing in a carbon credit trading system, which is going to be put in place very shortly. I mean, I'm doing something right now as an op-ed, which will draw attention to the fact that, it's good that we're trying that, but we ought to calibrate the carbon credit trading system in a manner that is consistent with a net zero target. I mean, there's no point calibrating a carbon credit trading system which is geared to a carbon price of $10. You could start with something which ends up with a $10 carbon price, but it should be quite clearly designed to go higher up. Otherwise, the transition won't take place. So that sort of question needs to be thought out much more and needs to be discussed much more. I think on the global side, and this is my last sentence, I think we have to stop focusing on COPs. COPs have their own life. I mean, they are a kind of form of biodiversity, and we shouldn't interfere with it. But the honest truth is that if you can't get the G20 to firmly commit itself to climate change, nothing's going to happen in the UN framework. In a way, I would have thought that Europe has a big role to play by first getting the G7 on board. Now, you saw what happened in Canada, understandably, because the Israel-Iran thing, I mean, upended everything on the agenda. But there's going to be another G7 next year. So to my mind, and this year, the G20 will be in South Africa. The good news, I'm told, I have no real information, I think the US has decided to attend, which is good. But I don't think between now and December, there's going to be any change. The next G20 is to be hosted by the United States. So really, I mean, anybody who has an influence in the G7, and many of you probably do, should work towards making the G7 more conscious of its role in sending out the right message, and then hope to inject that really into the G20. One big part on the financial side is, of course, private sector. I mean, countries are willing to accept it. This is not going to help the low-income countries. But, middle-income countries, including India, which is at the bottom of this lot, probably can if we get our policies together. So that's an important area to work on. I think the World Bank, MIGA, IFC, these institutions could help quite a bit in putting their money into projects and programs in a manner that would leverage more private flow. But for that, they need a very clear signal really from the G20, which really means the United States, because they have the dominant role in the shareholding. So I think the diplomatic side of the effort, instead of the present arrangement, which is entirely focused on the COP activity, needs to be broadened so that this is put on the agenda of the other two. Well, that's more or less what I have to say. I've exceeded my limit, so I seek
Well,
your...
you're very welcome, Montek. So thank you very much for this overview, and I think it really captures all the key points that you're making, and that you're making very, very clearly in that paper. So I found your paper a fantastic read, really, not just of what India, the situation that India faces and what it might do, but more generally about climate action and where we stand, what the key vectors of action are. So it's a very, very useful read. And it comes at a time where India is kind of grappling with this internally. So you make the case that India is going to be very significantly affected by climate change. You make the case that India therefore also has a very sort of proper interest in acting on climate change. You discuss the international framework. You're skeptical about it, as you've said now, the COP framework, the UN framework, the need to bring this to the G7, the G20, in order to drive change at the international level. And then you go into great detail on areas of action that India would have to embark on in order to meet these objectives. So let me just pick up a few points and ask you just to get a little bit more into detail. So one thing that I come out with from the paper is, so it should be clear to India that there's something that it needs to do. It should also be clear that there are hurdles. So if technology isn't quite there yet, and states have different interests, etc. So how are you going to get the political economy lined up in India to take those actions? So how do we come from your program, which is very well set out, to the actual political decisions on this?
Well, thanks, Hans. That is indeed a key question. But, to my mind, the first thing is that the larger aggregative program needs to be broken up, as I've suggested. I mean, what I've suggested is one kind of breakup. There could be others, broken up into sectorally more specific and detailed targets. And those need to be endorsed at some national decision-making level. I've suggested that we set up a kind of a high-level commission chaired by the Prime Minister, which also includes the state government chief ministers as representatives. Because, I mean, without their buy-in, it just won't happen on the ground. The other interesting thing is that, I think this intermediate stage, that what does it require, differs from state to state. I mean, in some states, for example, places like Rajasthan and so on, I mean, the most important thing is to make it possible for people who want to set up solar plants to get land, which actually, if a government really was determined to do it, can be done. And this would all not be public sector stuff. This is all private sector stuff. So there would be private sector guys wanting to sort of pitch in and compete. And secondly, it's the kind of area where competition is possible. There's not just one person doing solar. All the big guys will obviously do it, but there'll be middle guys and so on. So I think we need some formal ratification of, if you like, lower level targets subscribed to by the state governments. At the moment, for example, in Tamil Nadu, I'm on the advisory, they've set up some advisory body for the chief minister. I keep saying this, that too much of the announcement is in terms of missions. We have a something solar mission, or we have a something electrical mobility mission. I mean, these are not very useful. But for example, if they were to say, we are going to induct so many thousand, whatever, megawatts worth of household solar panels, and we're going to have so much of large solar farms. We are going to convert all the existing wind farms, there are many in Tamil Nadu, into wind farms with much higher productivity, higher height for the nacelle, et cetera, et cetera. So if they went into that, then immediately you'd see they would know who has to do it. Otherwise, if you're just sort of at the macro level, nobody is held responsible for anything. Having done that, I think it's a lot easier to actually fix the problem. But even that is not automatic. I mean, for example, very strong vested interests would be involved. The electricity distribution system, for example, they're brought up in the form of a natural monopoly. We are the DISCOM for Tamil Nadu, and they're quite happy to have different people supply stuff to them, which they then distribute. But they haven't worked out that, if a large percentage of this is going to become intermittent, then price variation has to play some role. And this is not in their consciousness at the moment, though it's creeping in on the outside. So I think this is not going to happen. It's not as the planners are going to set all this out and then they're going to do it. You start something, it will be somewhat inferior. But if it's open for discussion, then the kind of limitations come out. I mean, for example, I'm writing a piece which will come out shortly on our new carbon credit trading system. Now, they've done a lot of good work. They've indicated what are going to be the targets for emissions per unit of output for a whole range of activities. And over the next 2 years, they're reducing them. But the reduction over 2 years in the intensity of emissions is only 2% on average. Now, if the economy is going to grow at 6%, that means emissions are going to grow. Maybe in the short term, as I said in the graph, that's necessary. But has somebody got it clear in their minds that by 2040, this has to go down sharply? And if it does, then isn't it better to announce it now rather than every 2 years? Because if you announce it now, the guys who are in the business of replacing equipment will factor that into their investment decisions. So I think there's a lot of such detail before you address the political issue. And I mean, the problem with the political issue is simply that climate change is one of those things that, the benefits come over a long period, and all politics relates to benefits tomorrow, if not tomorrow, at least day after tomorrow, if you want to take a medium-term view. I mean, India has no unique way of solving that problem. But to my mind, a much more educated public, which is aware of this thing, and most of all, actually, the kids. But quite honestly, is the younger people, it's amazing how willing they are to accept change, whereas their dads and moms just are not. So you need a lot of school level, because we're talking about 2070, that's a hell of a long time away. So 20 years from now, all the people who are 30, if you set up a target that 20 years from now, which is only 2040 something, all the guys who are at the age of 35, and therefore substantial body of opinion, are fully aware of these problems, and you just achieve that, I think you'd have done a lot. At the moment, people are just not aware. In fact, even the graph that I showed you, the average GDP growth built into that graph is only 6.4%. Now, that happens to be the rate at which right now we're growing. The aspirational target of becoming a developed country by 2047, which is what the government has stated, would require a 2 percentage point increase in the growth rate underlying that graph. The point of putting it up was simply that, look, if you can move the curve that much, if you have the other ability to raise growth, you can do other things that will move the curve even more. The main factor underlying that, quite honestly, is that technology is moving very rapidly. And this is where I feel that the greatest thing that the Western countries could do is to recommit themselves to decarbonization. Because it's when they do that, that technology will get unleashed and we will benefit from that technology. If they're sort of quite happy not decarbonizing and sort of operate on the assumption there's nothing wrong with fossil fuels after all, then there'll be a big stop in that growth of technology. You mentioned another thing on technology, which I mentioned in the paper, that, trade. I mean, it just happens that in solar, the one country that has done an outstanding job in building capacity for equipment relevant for this is China. So they've, as a result of this huge excess capacity, excess in the sense that their capacity is twice the world's requirement at the moment. I mean, the world price of these solar cells has dropped by something like 50% or so. And of course, a lot of Indian producers who, believing our kind of targets of decarbonizing, have set up their own facility, and they're all calling it dumping and this and that and the other. But what do we do? That's a real tough one.
Mhm.
And part of the problem is that, particularly since in the United States, there's now a feeling that China is not a fair trader. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, in the sense that the Chinese government is in a position to subsidize whatever it wants to a very substantial extent. Our own producers will raise these points. Of course, the logical answer to that is that if you don't want to disturb prices, then you should subsidize your own producers. But of course, our fiscal position doesn't allow that. Now, mind you, if we were to go the carbon tax route, it would allow that. But we're not going down that route. So what do we do? I don't have an answer to this, but all I'm saying is, let's start having these discussions. And I think something will turn up.
So the essential obstacle is you have vested interests on the one side, you have the politics of higher costs and how to get the population to accept sort of higher costs for energy and other things on the other, and sort of one solution or one approach to what that would be to import cheap technology, so to bring in the Chinese, but then you undermine the ability of India itself to build the industrial base.
It's not cheap technology, cheap imports.
Cheap imports.
No problem with importing technology.
So you have that. So if you look at Nick Stern, for instance, his vision is that the climate transition itself becomes a motor of industrial change and development and sort of the next industrial revolution. Is what what you're saying sort of suggests that it's going to be hard for India's industrialists to deal with this right now? How do you turn this into an opportunity?
I mean, Nick is certainly right that if the change were facilitated and if we focused on the question that, look, this technology exists and both producers of solar equipment as well as users of electricity should not be prevented from benefiting from the low world prices, then I mean, yes, it would do exactly that. But the trouble is that all the arguments that are used in the US to justify high tariffs against China will be used in India by the producers. So what do we do? To be honest, I don't have a good answer to that. But I mean, that at the moment, we're not even having a debate. I mean, nobody is getting up. Nobody's getting up and saying, really, there's no problem because we need to go solar. And if our solar electricity prices are higher, we must pass that on in the form of higher electricity charges to the public. And we must bear that as a way of financing sensible. Nobody wants to do that. And the problem is that since solar is, solar at the moment is not actually fully competitive with coal. If you add battery costs, then it's a little more expensive than new coal. And as long as coal is there, it's going to be that much more difficult to say, well, we can make the solar even more expensive, and it's a good thing for us because of all sorts of other benefits, like, so global warming, air pollution, etc. So that debate is not taking place. It's still at the realm of generalities. I mean, it needs to take place. And that's why I personally feel that if this happens at the state level, because, this is not a government of India decision. I mean, if a particular state were to say that, look, we accept the notion that we don't want to rely on, we put some kind of a countervailing duty or a duty, offsetting duty on Chinese imports, So actually the imports of solar cells from China become more expensive, and that's fine. We'll allow our regulator, or more or less inform our regulator, those are the prices, so they must get reflected in the electricity price. Now, the policy that the government is following on renewable electricity is compulsory purchase. But they've said that, look, every discom and every large user must purchase whatever 30% now, and it'll go up to 40, etc. So it doesn't matter. Let them charge a higher price, and we just force the electricity system to buy that at a higher price. But that means you must allow it to be passed on. And then, I don't think the consumers are actually aware that this is the choice. Either you allow Chinese solar cells or you pay more for electricity. I don't think anyone's aware of that. And when this is broken down at state level, views may differ, because the solar cell production, although Indian, is not necessarily taking place in your state. So, that introduces yet another political dimension, which we have to see how it plays out. I mean,
So that question of industrial policy, I'm sure, is going to come back in our discussion later. There's one final point I wanted to just hear your thoughts on, is this international diplomacy dimension. And India, during the G20 in particular, during its G20 presidency, had sort of a moment where it was taking the lead on these issues, in particular when it comes to climate finance. India really made a big difference in that context in the G20. You have this skepticism that the UN framework is really going to achieve results. You feel that it's those at the international level, it's the G7, it's the G20 that need to take this on. Is India going to be able? Do you see India willing to continue playing that leadership role? Because I have to say, after that G20 moment, there has been a little bit of, we've heard a bit less.
Well,
active,
the G20 is a funny body, because it moves every year. So every country which is hosting the G20 organizes its G20 to appear to be giving a lead, but is in no position to give a lead once somebody else takes over. It doesn't have a permanent secretariat. So the next presidency determines whatever the agenda is. Now, I think actually this is a purely personal view, and I don't even know if it's a view shared by the government. But, I think that the real breakthrough or constructive contribution of the G20 chaired by India was to set up this group, which had Larry Summers and my good friend Montek Singh as co-chairs. Larry representing, a very broad range of sensible opinion on the West. And I think what they managed to do was to shift the debate a little bit away from simply UN climate funds, although they didn't negative those, but say that, look, the whole thing requires a major effort by the MDBs. So the shifting of focus from what the COPs do, which is the UN climate funds, to the enormous potential for doing things through MDB reform and restructuring was a genuine contribution. Now, it's for other G20 members to take that forward. I mean, I'm sure that India would applaud any effort to carry that forward. But the same report received no mention at all in the next COP, because the COPs remain focused on UN climate. So when you say UN, if you go to the ministries of finance, they think of the World Bank as UN. If you go to the ministries of foreign affairs, they think of the UN as the UN. And they don't really think of the MDBs. They think of them as inferior and captive organizations rather than UN. So when you say UN, what do you mean? I personally do not think that there is any chance of getting a large flow of funds through the various climate finance windows that have opened up in the UN. Maybe, I mean, from the developed country point of view, their fiscal position is strained, genuinely. And that strain is heightened by the increased requirements for defense. So in the next couple of years, I mean, all of them are going to be scurrying around trying to fix the budget. But let's say 2, 3 years down the road, when things open up, I doubt if they would be using the UN. I mean, sure, the climate finance thing, which is whatever, 10 billion will go up by a billion or two. But the real money is through the MDBs. There, quite frankly, there was a genuine concern. What is US politics going to determine? Okay. The Heritage Foundation, which is a very influential sort of pro-right Republican group, they actually recommended that the United States should leave the World Bank and the IMF. I mean, they also say leave the WTO and WHO, which they more or less have done. They haven't left the WTO and it's become irrelevant. The Trump administration, having thought this out, have more or less signaled that they're not going to leave the IMF and the World Bank. So at least you're not in a Heritage House Foundation world. But they've also signaled that they want these organizations to do different things, and they certainly don't want at the moment the World Bank to do anything much on climate finance. Now, will that change in a couple of years? Maybe it will. I think one of the big problems, frankly, this is something which isn't brought out very clearly. Funding by the World Bank requires competitive bidding by all member countries, which includes China. Now, China is the world's leading manufacturer in many things. So it is a consequence of sending money through the World Bank that you must accept a very, very high percentage of those orders will be filled by Chinese suppliers. I'm not sure that the major contributors to the World Bank are happy with that. And that is why you're getting these complicated proposals that the World Bank creates a platform. And the platform is the World Bank, you say you want to give $1 billion or something to some major developing country. The World Bank puts 100 million there, and then gets the US and Britain and Japan and maybe other European countries to put corresponding amounts, which would mean that, procurement against these funds would be guided by whatever procurement guidelines the countries have. I mean, for example, some may exclude China completely. Others may limit it. European countries may want to limit it to EU only, which would rule out both UK and US. We don't know. But a lot of this enthusiasm that we can get it done through platforms is sort of funny, because what you're really saying is we're going to use the World Bank's, if you like, convening power and organizing power and management power to get the government to agree on a platform of funding climate finance, and then we'll separately find a lot of people willing to finance it. But it's a very cumbersome procedure. And I think we need to rethink that.
In a way that brings it back to industrial policy, because it's kind of using international financing tools to get around the China problem.
Exactly.
With that, maybe Montek, if you're okay, we're just going to turn to our two discussants. And I think, Sarah, this is what Montek was commenting on at the end is exactly the kind of area that you specialize in, and maybe you want to provide some perspectives.
Now woefully underprepared, because as soon as you spoke about industrial policy, I thought we'd be jumping over to Jody, who is much more expert in that than me. So I might pick up a little earlier if you don't mind, Montek. But firstly, let me say thank you for that whirlwind tour of ideas on India's climate policy and how they fit into the broader, should we go with complex landscape at the moment. So it's really valuable to hear the insights from someone who's seen how these operate, how both governments operate domestically, but also how they might interact to achieve, or in the case of climate, not achieve shared goals. So I want to pick up on some of the things you said, using your own scales, the global, the national, and the state. And firstly, on the global, it's obviously not a good time in the world to be getting biblical, but I completely agree with you on mitigation, that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. This model that we have in the negotiations or in domestic policy at the moment, that the the US won't act until China does, and India won't act until the US does, and Australia, where I'm from, won't act until absolutely everybody else has, is really just going to leave all of our children and grandchildren in a hotter and more dangerous, poorer world. And so your arguments about the role that India can play as a major economy were really welcome. I am, however, going to swoop in defense of Europe, because I can do that as an Australian, just to say that one of the great weaknesses of the UNFCCC system, and you touched on a bunch of them, is that it continues to treat developed countries like a bloc. And I think, you know, at the moment, the EU is on track for a 55% emission reduction relative to 1990 by 2030, and that's tremendous. UK emission levels are currently the same height that they were in the 1890s, Victorian levels. The European continent is almost single-handedly bearing the costs of any emission reductions we have achieved so far, although obviously it won't bear the brunt of adaptation costs. It is really the US that is the challenge in this situation, and others hiding behind its coattails. And in the context of the new collective quantified goal, the new 300 billion target that you spoke about, we worked very closely with a whole range of negotiators towards that unsatisfactory outcome. And I wanted to just clarify the timelines, which is, those of you who are at the COP will remember that it was in the first 2 or 3 days of COP last year that we found out that Trump had been elected. And so you effectively had all the other developed countries who had talked about a 600 billion target, realizing that the developed country that accounted for half of their cumulative emissions and half of their economy would no longer credibly be at the table. I think that's why we really ended up with a 300 billion, because it is a target that is resting primarily on the German balance sheets. On the national level, just much more briefly, I wanted to say, your point about the 2070 timeframes really resonated with me. Someone said to me recently that India is going to peak at a level of emissions per capita that is lower than any other major economy, and it's then subsequently going to decarbonize faster than any other major economy. And obviously there are inequalities, and obviously there's a global crisis, but it is certainly not getting the recognition it deserves for those targets. And I think that's really, really tremendous. The last point I wanted to make is to come back to your fantastic point about the state level action. And I'm going to speak to some of the work led here by my colleague Prashant, who may have to subsequently correct some of my figures. The growth of solar, as you say, poses such a challenge to the viability of coal plants, and particularly those older and more inefficient coal plants that cause the most emissions, that cause the most air pollution, which is obviously such a chronic problem, and are also less able to ramp up and ramp down quickly. And that's a real problem, because of course, as we see increasing heat, that electricity supply is going to have to ramp up for air conditioning and then ramp down very quickly. And what you have in India is this diversity of contractual and tariff arrangements, which mean that India's state-owned electricity boards are going to have these perverse incentives in place, where these outdated contracts that the older coal plants have, the state electricity boards are incentivized to continue paying them more and meeting their fixed costs. So the first ones that are going to be closed down are actually the ones that are cleaner and the ones that are best suited to match with solar. The average plant load of coal, Prashant and Archie's work found, the average plant load factor, which is about how much it's utilized, is around 56%, whereas the owner or an operator of a coal-fired power plant would usually like about 85%. What they found is that in a net zero scenario, that's going to drop down to 20% on the average coal plant in 2030, which is just not economically viable. So you have there this, and because the costs for this ultimately sit with state-owned electricity boards, you have this situation where the people who have made the investment decisions are effectively off the hook, and who are continuing to make some of those investment decisions. And so something, perhaps after Jody spoke, that's something I'd love to hear from you, is about, in some of these states which have coal-fired power plants of different ages, different levels of carbon and pollution intensity, over the next 5 to 10 years, how can they go about renegotiating these contracts, restructuring their tariffs, things that are so politically sensitive and challenging, in a way that might allow the phase out of coal to be done, both in a way that leaves you with a more resilient electricity grid and with cleaner air and with the minimal amount of political fallout? Love to hear your thoughts.
Well,
Thanks for that. Do
You
you
want
want
to respond in turn or wait after both? discuss?
Why don't you just jump in on
Okay.
this, Montek?
Yeah, no, I mean, just one thing on the state level. You were a bit rude about Australia, but I was just reading that South Australia has decided to go net zero. Now, admittedly, it's only one province, but it illustrates what I said, that subnational levels can kind of generate enthusiasm. And I think what I read there was quite credible. You know, a lot of solar, household solar stuff we're also doing, but we're not doing on anything like that scale. So I think at the state level, I think you're absolutely right that we need a major education task on the part of state distribution companies. How do we help them through various types of renegotiation? I mean, the government has just set up a committee in India under Nandan Nilekani. Now, he's a very credible, he's a business guy, I mean, ex-business guy, techie person, and they're supposed to work out to what extent can a digital infrastructure underlying a decentralized system of supply, where a whole lot of people will be producing solar power and maybe selling it to their neighbors, etc., could be made to work. So there's pretty high level thinking going into that, but it's still at the level of a committee. I mean, it's when the committees always work on the assumption that vested interests can either be compensated or ignored or politically overcome. That's not what actually happens. So let's see what he comes up with. But, you know, over the next several years, I think renegotiating some of these contracts is certainly possible. I don't know, for example, whether it could be made possible by simply passing a law which would require them to do so in the public interest. I mean, that would be one way. Of course, a lot of the suppliers are really the National Thermal Power Corporation. So the guys who would be affected are not just state coal plants, it will also be central coal plants. You know, one of the biggest problems, which I think we could address, is how to use the available hydroelectricity in order to do balancing. It's true that the hydroelectric, all the hydroelectric stuff on a cost basis is providing power at very, very cheap rates. Now, admittedly, that's usually providing it to the state where the hydroelectric plant is located. But there must be some way of compensating the state and at the same time facilitating more use of hydro in a manner that would balance the solar. Now, this has to be related to the release of water for irrigation. But what I mean is these possibilities for optimization have not even been addressed seriously. I mean, for example, I mean, we buy electricity, hydroelectricity from Bhutan, we buy hydroelectricity from Nepal. You know, for example, have we considered introducing an incentive that if you provide the electricity in what are solar off-peak power hours, we depart from whatever we've agreed and sort of pay you a higher price. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but it's more complicated than we think. But then we have a lot of time. I mean, it's really in the next 5 years that we need to kick off this stuff and get a whole lot of action. And the reason I mentioned South Australia is that we need to be aware of what's happening in the rest of the world. And the more people become aware of this, the more they will sort of learn to find out ways of solving the problem in India. In my view, too much attention has been paid on getting money. You know, the whole strategy has been that, look, solar and renewables are expensive. Don't worry about it. We're going to negotiate a huge sum of money from the COPs. Now, this was frankly a con game. I mean, I think we should recognize that that particular game is over. But if you think of what can be done, I mean, look, in solar, particularly these cells based on perovskite and so on. I'm not a tech person, but I can read these things every now and then. The rate of advancement is still taking place quite substantially. This is going to be a big problem. It's related to the trade front. I mean, if technology was frozen, and we just didn't want to import from China, that will be one cost. But if technology is moving rapidly, and we don't want our domestic producers to be subjected to any competition, whether Chinese or not, and there's nothing in the system that forces the domestic producers to keep track with what's happening globally, we could get stuck with a very highly high cost system, which doesn't seem to me to make sense. We don't have a solution to that, but I think we need this to be discussed more often, more openly, so that you will generate system pressure within the system itself.
Thank you, Montek. And so with that, we're still good on time. That's why it's if
Okay.
you want to respond directly, that's perfectly fine. But a perspective from the trade industrial policy angle.
Sure.
Jody?
It's just a real privilege to listen to you. Also, just to really set that your introductory remarks, just the breadth of your work and the depth of the work you've done is just really amazing. So it's a privilege to listen.
Thank you.
And you're obviously here today with us on London Climate Week. So there's a lot going on. We've also just had the kind of new UK strategy launched, and obviously just ahead of that, the UK managed to get a free trade agreement over the line with India, and everyone is very pleased about that, but we don't yet have the details. So it's going through the legal scrubbing. So as you were talking, I was thinking all about, what role will this new partnership play? Obviously, the UK's got a strong interest in services, and the detail that you were running through actually relates to that sector, but we don't yet have the detail there. But we do know that the UK and India were able to get around some of these thorny issues in relation to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So my understanding at the moment is that this is trickier in the case of the EU FTA, and that this week actually there are discussions, and that then the next round will begin on the 7th of July. And I just want to zoom in a bit on this because it touches on the points that you were making about the need to get really sector specific, and you do touch on that in your paper around the challenges of decarbonisation in the steel sector in particular. And I think you also make the point about, how can trade policy help and assist these goals? And there are kind of mixed views on CBAM in this respect. But some of the discussions that I've had lately with individuals about also flagged some issues about the use of export restrictions on scrap metal by the EU, which is also seen to be hindering India's decarbonisation efforts. So there's quite a lot going on in that area. It's not quite clear yet how the issues will be resolved. Could there be a new partnership approach included in the agreement on, ETS, emissions trading schemes, kind of best practice? There's so much to learn from the experience of the EU, but also the increasing experience of other countries as well. So I think the point that I want to make really is thinking about the partnerships and the new relationships that will assist India in its decarbonisation goal. And you do have to get extremely specific, and there's still quite a lot to kind of play for in this space. My understanding is that the UK doesn't have those restrictions on scrap metals, which may be a reason why the UK deal got over the line. I don't know all of the details, and we don't yet have the final text. Also, another way in which it might be these issues may be resolved is through the use of a rebalancing mechanism. We've seen that in other FTAs and the EU Mercosur. And this again comes back to the fact that people don't want to talk about the carbon border adjustment measure as being a trade measure. They want to relegate it elsewhere. So we've got to see how these issues will be resolved. But the second point then that I wanted to make, you've kind of got this potential positive, potential negative spillovers from the EU Green Deal or other countries' industrial policies. And then you've also got the positive spillovers that may arise from technology and technological advancements. And I just want to highlight one area here, because what I see when just coming back last week, I spent quite a bit of time at the WTO listening to the different discussions in the trade and development week. And what I saw in the case of India was an India that is still speaking on behalf of the global South, that is still reaffirming commitments to provide aid for trade. And this was in contrast to the US. So the India is still playing that role within the system. Of course, India's been blamed for also causing problems at the WTO, but it is still, stating quite vocally that it is seeking to advance the interests of smaller, poorer, more vulnerable economies. And we have seen some submissions on technology transfer by India as well, particularly in the areas of food security and climate change adaptation. So that's really positive. And I also see another positive development, something that Prachi and I have been talking about quite a bit, in relation to the sodium batteries overtaking lithium. It's also an area where India really is trying to get ahead. And obviously this also avoids some of the trickier dynamics with use of critical minerals and so on. So that's really positive. So I'm really quite optimistic for the role that India can play within kind of not only its own decarbonisation, but also kind of global decarbonisation, and bringing in, making sure that smaller, poorer, vulnerable economies are not left behind. The reform agenda of India over recent years, recent decades, as you say, the kind of movement away from the licensed large system, that was a huge development. So potentially, India getting the right frameworks in place as well will see just as much transformation. So I think I'll end there on the more positive note, but I think there's a lot to play for in terms of getting the right partnerships that can accentuate positive spillovers and try to mitigate them.
Well, thank you. I share your, your positive note aspect, because I think if you get away from global negotiations and think of India wanting to be open, that's what we say, and I think we're trying to do that. And certainly the FTA, which again, I mean, they talk about the fine print. I don't know what I have no idea. But having an FTA with both UK and EU would be a huge step forward. All these things that you mentioned on partnership, I think would be enormously valuable for India. I mean, one, anyone here who's knowledgeable about the way emissions trading systems work would be well advised to apply their mind in a positive, critical way to the outline of which the Bureau of Energy Efficiency has given of the system that is going to be put in place in India. They've indicated, as I mentioned, they've indicated a baseline figure for about 20 different processes in terms of emissions allowed per unit of output. And they've indicated for the next 2 years how that's going to go down. Now, this is just a 2-year thing. And, while I did say that, we need a longer term horizon, it's good that it's 2 years, because it allows a chance to review what's happening and do the longer term thing with more knowledge. I mean, nothing would be worse than announcing a 10-year program, because then departing from that program would be horrendous. So I think anyone looking at it, wanting to study it, should be encouraged to do so. And if any of you want to come and give a lecture on it in the institution that I'm associated with, which is the Center for Social and Economic Progress, you're welcome. We'll arrange a lecture. But, apart from this kind of ideas thing, I would say that other forms of partnership, like learning from, say, what South Australia is doing, Southern Australian province, on building a distribution system which is suitable for a set of distributed electricity generators dealing with a larger market. And how do they get a fair distribution between the DISCOM and the relationship between the producers and the distributed suppliers? That would be very useful. Certainly the areas you mentioned, which are technology related, batteries, sodium versus lithium, whatever we can do on minerals. I think these partnerships the government can bless them, But these partnerships really depend on companies getting together. And I think our companies, I find, are beginning to take an interest. And some of the larger fellows have bought up little energy research companies in the UK and in Europe, because I think that's what they're interested in. Now, this becomes relevant. This brings in the issue of the investment side of an FTA. Now, of course, we are apparently negotiating the FTA, and we are separately negotiating a BIT, an investment treaty. Let's hope both of those things go well, because if we don't get a satisfactory outcome on the investment treaty, then it'll hold up these partnerships. I don't know that the government has much to do other than bless it and be open. And I think on this, the government's very clear. There is no, I mean, I'm not speaking for the government. I don't have that authority, but from what I can see, we're not closing down technology. If there's a British company that wants to sell technology and an Indian company that wants it, that's fine. If there's an Indian company that is interested in some technology being developed in a small British company and buys it, that's also fine. After that, it's for these businesses to do what they have to do. And we ought to create an environment in which that is possible, because this huge decline in increase in productivity and decline in costs, if the world is actually going to make a change, is going to open up a huge number of opportunities. And India has now enough middle to larger scale companies that can actually go and sort of trade, deal with these guys, make deals, including mergers and acquisitions. And I think both countries don't have an objection to that. So I think the more we get of that, the better. I'm a little concerned about the voice of the global South. I mean, I'm not being one of the most, my experience is that whenever we pretended or wanted to be the voice of the global South, we get hitched onto something or the other, and are quite, nobody authorizes us to negotiate for them, which means that they will buy whatever we negotiate. They authorize us to speak on their behalf, and they separately do their deals when necessary. I think the best way that India can be the voice of the global South is if the global North keeps pointing to Indian examples and saying, hey, this is a great example. Why don't you do what the Indians are doing and talk to them? But putting this into a diplomatic agenda is actually counterproductive. I'm not aware of any southern country that has wanted any other southern country to be its voice. I mean, if they did, they would say that, look, it's too expensive going to COP. We are just going to authorize the Indian delegation to negotiate. That's not what they do. They all want to go to COP and they want the Indians to support them. Fine, we want them to support us. But that's just sort of bargaining space. I would downplay, it's purely a personal prejudice. I mean, I'm sure that many people in India think it feels nice to be the voice of the global South. It would be much better if we were to position ourselves to be an example for the global South and be able to say that, look, we did this, and X, Y, and Z are doing the same thing. The International Solar Alliance a little bit works like that. And I think we should really use the model.
Great. Thanks, Montek. So we've heard all sorts of perspectives already, and that's very good. And I find there's quite a bit of substance that's been added to your paper. We hope you'll be able to incorporate that in future editions. But with that, I wanted to open it up to the rooms. And I don't know, Anna, you're kind of moderating the chat if some things come in.
I passed some questions on to you.
You did? Okay. Okay. So we'll get to that. I just wanted to first give the room an opportunity as well. Yeah, Prachi. Okay, let's go with Prachi, with Prasant, Frederic, and Tom. Thank you,
Dr. Ahluwalia. Excellent comments. I have two small questions for you. One is that, sorry, let me introduce myself. I'm Prachi Ahluwalia. I'm a research fellow in the I work with Jody in trade policy. issues different clouds to gender. Going back to what you said about the idea of the industrial policy, you know, how do you get modern? How do you see the PLI scheme working, which I perceive as a to say the least. How do you see the PLI scheme, which is the production linked incentive scheme in India? How do you see that working towards the government? That's one. Should our focus not be on investment in tech transfer, that's difficult, rather than people substitution? One that. Second, in 30 years ago, states were allowed to compete. So that led to the growth of the services sector, the IPTs and sector. There was no central meddling, so as to say, in that at that stage. Do you think that is the way forward for the organization of law? You have very rightly pointed out that states, if left to their own accord, will be the light bearers for decarbonization. So should that then be linked to the distribution of central budgets or some other incentives, central incentives, if states were to outcompete each other for decarbonization?
Thanks, Patsy. If you're okay, Montek,
Yeah,
we'll
we'll take
gather
a
a
few
few
back.
points from around the table. I think Prashant.
Thanks. Again, I want to echo aspects in wide range of what we get. I'm Prashant Vazay, I work here as a senior research associate. I was particularly interested by two of your items. One was this idea of state level renewables targets, and actually, they exist already, but actually enforcing them and giving them some teeth. The second, having customers face more cost-reflective tariffs. So just to give some perspective to other people, and there's just 4 or 5 states in India which really dominates generation. So I just start with the states of the east, hardly any. And in terms of cost-reflective tariffs, the work that we did last year, we sort of showed that the discount in the aggregate spend more on electricity than the receiving ceased to sell electricity. Tariffs have such low levels, huge subsidies for farmers and station investments. Just a small points. I mean, the current tariffs for solar plus storage now coming in at 7 cents a watt, really, really cheap, very, very cheap, even with I think as Sarah pointed out, some of the states like Bihar, Chhattisgarh, places like that, have got huge amounts of capacity. The tariff structure is kind of locking them into the discount from purchasing problem. They have to pay fixed cost regardless of whether they use it or not. And this creates a kind of sort of cycle of indebtedness of discounts that essentially has to be bailed out in 4 or 5 years. And it completely inhibits the renewable penetration, taking advantage of this very, very low cost of storage. I'm just wondering, given your experience of having commission and work using on redistribution, how do we actually help these coal producing states in the East find worthwhile jobs with their contractors for Indian employees, which just announced a massive expansion in their mines? So that we don't have to keep on subsidizing them. It's terribly inefficient and carbon restricted.
Thanks, Prashant. Really?
Thank you very much. I'm Frederic Dahan. I'm the Director of Development and Public Finance here at ODI. I'm nowhere near as knowledgeable as my colleagues. So my question, and I was really delighted to listen to you because not only is really interesting, but it's also quite hopeful. So it's uplifting. We need that. I didn't hear a lot of reference in your presentation. I haven't read the paper around nature positive measures. Is there a vision also to achieve net zero with nature positive policies? I'm thinking you mentioned about land, we mentioned about air pollution, which obviously is a big problem in India as well as in other countries. Is there even a possibility to sequence it or parallel? Just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Sam.
Sorry, Montek, there's going to be a big list, but I'm Tim Doberman. I'm the Director of Research at IGC, a Global Research and Policy Centre at LSE in Oxford. I thought I'd just share our perspectives as a proud OCI card holder, not representing IGC in terms of what I think some of the opportunities are. in India. I think we touched on this in both Sarah's points and in your points. My standpoint is starting off as a miserly economist, and I look at like the extent of technological progress just keeps stunning me. I mean, what was for batteries and solar, what was 100 in 2010 is now maybe 10. And that's going to fall down 75% more if you just extrapolate these learning curves in the next 15 years. So what was 100 in 2010 will be 2 or 3 in 2040. And indeed, some people are talking about a world where electricity is so cheap it's not worth metering. So I guess what I'm wondering is like, how can India tap into this? Already, India in many ways is a leader in deploying things like solar at scale. But I am also concerned sometimes as a dialogue when you reference this yourself that there's almost this realist, pragmatic argument that comes forward that says this will come another day. You know, we don't need this now, let's wait. And I think some of these constraints that Sarah highlighted really, I think, are worth looking at and thinking more carefully. One is on the power of contracting. So again, we're not making year-by-year decisions, we're making 30-year decisions, right? If we expand coal, that's a 30-year thing that will stay in the system or painfully try to renegotiate, right? So I think that long-term perspective is a challenge. Secondly, there's this a great paper in Chile that looks at one of the big things that allowed Chile to expand private investment into solar was the interconnectivity between the Atacama Desert and Santiago. So basically infrastructure, but also trade. And I think one of the challenges in India is cross-state trade, is I personally think quite underutilized. So I think a lot of infrastructure is there that needs more investments, but as we've mentioned, there's a lot of incentives to sell locally. And I think that lowers the market for, say, Rajasthan solar to really go all over. So I'm thinking about that as it. And the third perspective, just my own research that I think is interesting to consider, and others like Nick Ryan at Yale have done work on this, is we tend to focus on the discoms purely as a financial challenge. We need, we want to make them be functioning as utilities, both to provide better service, but also to kind of remove the expenditure side. But then in many cases, this has a spillover, right? Because they're the contracting off-taker. And so that really affects cost of capital, ability to actually get cheap solar. And I think, again, we should separate the technology cost, which is becoming unquestionable now, from the capital cost and the overall economic cost of these technologies, where maybe you're not getting cheap solar and battery storage just because the cost of capital is so high, the off-taker isn't defined. Utility. So I think these are all areas where there's a lot that can be done. I'm quite interested to hear your and other perspective.
Right.
There's a lot of questions.
Can I add?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
To one point that Tim made, we also have 2 comments from online and that go in the same direction, which is essentially about locking in the wrong technologies at this point, as India's emissions continue to climb, and then having trouble getting out of it. So in terms of roads, airports, power stations, etc., that have a considerable lifetime, are we kind of building up stranded assets at this point that will then create their own political economy to get out of and make it harder to get the curve. So a little bit along the same lines of the point that Tim made. So you have quite a few points to react to, and then there will be a couple of others.
Thank you. Well, actually, first of all, I should thank everybody for having either listened to me carefully enough or having read carefully enough, which shows up in some of the questions. They're going to stay with me much longer than any answers I give, because I'm quite conscious that my answers are a bit off the cuff, whereas I think the questions raise deeper, a need for deeper examination. So here's a set of off the cuff answers, okay? 1, PLI schemes. I was not a great supporter of the PLI schemes, although it is, the change in the international mood long before President Trump, that you're failing to recognize the nature of market failures, and hence the need to give some initial temporary, whatever it is, support. And it was always linked on, sometimes there's a linkage to the need for initial support, and sometimes it's linked to the need for support in critical areas. Now, actually, the way the PLI system has worked, the initial nature of the support was well reflected by simply saying this is a 5-year scheme. And after that, it ends. Because what's happened is, at the end of those 5 years, everybody is now lobbying for it to continue. But the great advantage of the PLI scheme, as opposed to tariffs, is that tariffs just continue without anyone thinking about them. In the PLI scheme, there must be some guy in the finance ministry who is saying that, look, since we started this stuff, we've now found all sorts of other things which are actually more important, whatever, sodium ion batteries, and so on. And we just can't keep having these schemes. So how we enforce the temporary nature of the PLI scheme still has to be sorted out. But because it's controlled by the finance ministry, and I think in India, the finance ministry has a reasonably good record, whichever way they do it, of not getting into an uncontrollable fiscal deficit. I think they'll fix it somehow. Don't know how, but they'll manage to do that. I think the other thing is we don't just have a PLI scheme. But the PLI scheme simply said, look, 5% or 6% of the value of output for the next 5 years, given a base year. We also have this capital subsidy scheme for the chips, which actually amounts to a very large capital subsidy. Now, that was justified on the grounds, and this was very strongly argued by many people, including Indians abroad and knowledgeable fellows who know about tech sector and what have you, that, you got to have some chip manufacturing capacity. Maybe the learning you do, etc. The capital subsidy in some of these chips is very high, almost, if you take the center and the state together, almost 70%, okay? And this is not this is only an assembly and testing plant. It's not a proper chip manufacturing fab. So I have no comment on that. I mean, it's good that we are having one, and let's see how it goes. I'm pretty sure that, since it will not reduce the need to import more sophisticated chips, there will be some resolution. What we need in the PLI scheme is a really good independent evaluation. And I've said publicly that this should not be done by the ministry that's running it. It should be assigned to Niti Aayog or something. So if you get an independent evaluation, let's see if that happens. On the states, they have an incentive. I mean, whether we can incentivize them through money. Yeah, I think we need to get away from this belief in India that whenever there's a good thing to be done, we can incentivize it by providing money. There must be a way of changing prices which incentivizes them anyway. So I'm not in favor of that. And frankly, I think if we make it clear that you're not going to get central government money to solve your problems, and if you have your energy pricing reasonably clear, the consequences of bad energy policy will really fall on the state itself. And somewhere we need to accept the proposition that if a government fails to manage its energy system, it should be a political pressure point that would go into the democratic process. It isn't. I mean, at the moment, if you give a lot of freebies and basically weaken your ability to provide essential support or management, etc., you're a political winner. So this is part of growing up. I have no simple solution, and I worry about it quite a bit. Now, the point about displacement of coal workers, that of course is a very valid issue. I don't have a simple solution. I don't think that the actual decline in the employment of coal miners is going to start happening anytime soon. Because on any peaking assumption, the demand for coal probably will go down from 2040 onwards. So it's some bits further away. And frankly, the only solution is going to be other growth that provides other employment opportunities. And you could have exactly the same problem, for example, with all the coding that is done. Because with AI coming in, and everybody tells me that the one job that will become irrelevant is simple coding. And we have a hell of a lot of people earning pretty good incomes just being coders. So the government has a lot to do in sort of ensuring that the displacement that technology and development generally will cause is somehow met by a growth of other employment opportunities. But I'm not thinking of any specific thing for the states. One issue that will be relevant, and the states will raise this, is that, look, they're getting a lot of royalty from the coal, which they will lose. And I think there's probably some case in the distribution of tax revenues and so on to provide something for the states that are losing, because these are all poorer states. And if you allow this to happen, not only will they have an employment problem because people displaced will not have jobs, but the ability to deliver social services will also be affected. And you want to offset that. So I think that is something that maybe the Finance Commission or some future Finance Commission needs to think about. But in all of this, it would be very good if advanced thinking is done so that by the time the next Finance Commission is appointed, which would be sometime in 2030, there's a lot of work on what the options are, rather than just leave it to that Finance Commission in the 1.5 years that it works to find a solution. So it's something we need to discuss. Nature positive, I think that is an important area. And frankly, it's there, but it has not received as much attention as it should. I mean, look, the biggest thing on the nature positive side is really to prevent excess runoff of water and ensure recharging of the aquifer. You would think, given that water is so essential, that the brightest people in the country and also the most powerful should be assigned to sort this out. And I hope that they are. But it's on the agenda, but I don't think it's seen as part of the global fight against climate change so far. The problem of Rajasthan, I don't think the idea is that the solar electricity in Rajasthan would be sold only in Rajasthan. The problem really is that if you set up a solar farm in Rajasthan and you contract with the central government, then the state government, I think, I need to double check, the state government cannot interfere with that contract. But if you're contracting with some other state, maybe the exporting state government, if necessary, could interfere. And maybe there's some role here for a central government purchase and trading corporation, where for renewable generation, that they buy the electricity and sell it. That has the big advantage that the state government cannot impose a restriction on the sale, which means if somebody has set up a plant in Rajasthan with the intention of exporting to the rest of the country, that would be one market. I think that is something we do need to make sure that it happens. Capital costs, of course, capital cost is high, but that just boils down to how can you improve the capital market. I don't think that the problem here is the same as the international one, because the international assessment of credit risk involves a large number of other things. But if you're just selling to another project in India, the capital cost is the capital cost in India. It's a rupee cost. It's not a dollar cost. So actually the equivalent dollar cost, if you adjust for the likely exchange rate of rupee, is not that bad. But yes, it is high. And I think there, frankly, to my view, too much of the money that comes into the banking system currently is preempted by the central government through compulsory investments in government bonds. And so really it's the old argument that we should reduce this to what is absolutely essential for prudential reasons. And that will free up resources to be allocated to other. But that's a general point. It's not specifically for this sector. And locking in the wrong technology at a high cost is a very valid issue. And I'm not sure that, I don't know how. I mean, as long as you're not protecting a producer, which I think generally, except for a very limited time, you should not. basically, as long as the guys who need the product or the technology are free to get it from wherever they want, there'll be enough signals to the producer to remain competitive. But it's true that if we get locked into an old technology, it will have very serious negative effects on the economy.
Maybe sort of recontracting some of the disco contracts might send a signal that that getting onto the wrong technology track is a very uncertain proposition. Look, we've run out of time. Unfortunately, it was we've covered such a broad waterfront, including one of the questions that so the last questions that were asked online. So I hope that that's been addressed. Unfortunately, we will have to leave it to bilateral afterwards. I was supposed to provide a significant summary of this discussion. Luckily, we've run out of time, so I'm not going to be able to do that. I wouldn't have been able anyway because there were too many elements. I just want to kind of sense the sort of the tone or the mood that I get out of this paper and out of this discussion is that there's kind of a hope, and in particular because of what you say, that in India that discussion is starting, and that that perhaps there are ways of encouraging this discussion, and it's probably the most important thing that we can do, and I take that from what you say right now, if we want to affect the political economy of change in India, is to build understanding around these things, build understanding around what's happening and what needs to happen. I also see a lot of potential and hope around the development of technology, and you will have taken some of the suggestions that have come from around the table on some of the aspects of the industrial policy aspects that you touch on in the paper. So it's a half hopeful paper, and I want to thank you again, Montek, for coming and presenting it to us. I think we're all sort of looking forward at future editions of it and at the impact that it's going to have. And with that, I also want to thank Suma. I want to thank Sarah and Jody for your very valuable inputs, and everybody else. So we will maybe have still an opportunity over coffee for a bilateral chat after this event.